There are powerful people right now trying to blame feminists for so many things, and it's absurd, but I worry that if people become really alarmed by birth rates per se, they might warm to more reactionary ideas.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we can be better versions of ourselves and build an intentional future we actually want to live in. Today, our focus is on the topic that sits at the intersection of economics, self-determination, policy, politics, and personal choice. The challenges or hidden opportunities that may come from a future with declining birth rates on a global scale. Our guest today is Rachel Cohen. She's a policy correspondent at Vox, and she helps us explore the pro-natalist movement that's happening today and the broader questions around the choices that all Earthlings have to bring younglings into this timeline of ours. But before we get there, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning PR firm Technica Communications and the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Before building these organizations, I was an award-winning environmental science reporter for NPR and PBS. And whether this is your first or 50th time tuning in, we encourage you to follow us on social media, leave some comments for us on these shows, give us a review, join the Substack newsletter, and that way you'll get notices once a month. We're not going to spam you on what's happening with the podcast and some binge lists that you can participate in. And if you do none of those things but still want to give back to the podcast, please consider joining our Patreon page. And if you're already a Patreon member, you're going to get the full access to the full interview with me and Rachel today because we talked for a long time and the conversation went in so many fascinating directions and we had to really cut it down. So you'll have access to that. And you can also share this podcast with a friend. Sometimes that is the single biggest gift you can give us without signing up for stuff if you don't want to do that. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. So, in past shows, we've talked about how there's all these various systems and industries that are grappling with the change that is upon us globally. And that's change is always a constant, right? There's always adaptations that we need to do. And today's episode does a deep dive into declining birth rates and what we can do about it, and in a way that honors all Earthlings for their choices related to their lifestyles, whether they want to have kids or not, right? And Rachel Cohen has done some extensive research and reporting for Vox on this topic. And her recent article was really insightful and gave some really interesting perspectives. And that's what prompted me to have her on the show. So you can read that article in our show notes. Rachel has been covering social policy issues in Washington, D.C. for over a decade. Her reporting has appeared in more than 24 national outlets, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bloomberg, The Daily Beast, and The Washington Post. We caught up with her on a sweltering day in Washington, D.C., where we started from the very basic topic of what is pronatalism anyway?
Pronatalism is basically a banner for a loosely aligned coalition of people who want to see more people on Earth. They think we should design our society and our culture to encourage more babies. And there's a concern about declining population that goes with that.
Right. So we've had these conversations around declining population for several decades now. We've watched Japan going through this. Why do you think some of this is coming up right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple things going on at this time. One of them is just that now it's really happening to the US, whereas before it was something that was sort of happening to other countries around the world, and Americans kind of dismissed it. They thought it wouldn't. American exceptionalism, that's just weird Europeans, or that's just a Asia problem. And now it's really sort of something we're seeing here, and it's something that when we first started to see it in the US, there was a feeling, well, it's tied to the recession, it's just tied to the economic downturn, and that's normal, and things will go back to normal. But then when the economy rebounded and things very much clearly did not go back to normal, then people thought, well, okay, but people will still have the same amount of children. They're just going to start later in life, so it's still not a problem. And so now in the US at least, we're looking around and say, okay, there's been actually this pretty steady decline since 2007 and hasn't reversed, and people are looking around the world that is also seeing declines in places that formerly had a much higher birth rate. We're seeing below replacement rate in countries like India, in countries that have still high marriage rates and low female participation rates. So we're seeing this 2/3. I'll put this in perspective. 2/3 of all people on Earth right now live in a country that has what demographers call below replacement rate, which means that they are not producing new people at the rate at which you would need to keep your population at the same size in generation. So I think there's that confluence of factors, and the other factor I think that's worth mentioning is, well, two. One is that we're gonna, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, but we're seeing a lot more leaders elected who are talking about it, and talking about it in slightly alarming ways. And then the last factor that I think is shaping why this is coming to a head right now is because even in the countries that used to sort of be the leaders in seeming like they figured out how to solve this, we're seeing they are having really hastening fertility drops over the last 10 years too. So now it's just this like global thing that everyone's like, oh man, what is going on and what do we do about it?
And what are you hearing are some of the economic and social challenges that might come from a declining population?
In a nutshell, the concerns are basically, most people today live in a country that depends on having an expanding labor force to support their welfare and pension systems, and their economy as a whole. They all sort of depend on economic growth funded largely through larger workforces. And if you don't have that, then that could lead to, unless something else changes, that could lead to a lot of economic problems, that could lead to more unemployment, more stagnation, um, more poverty, more intergenerational conflict, because you're going to have a smaller number of young people supporting an elderly population that still has political power. You might see more ethno-nationalism, more anti-immigrant sentiment. There's sort of a lot of geopolitical and economic issues that would come from this future if nothing else happens. And then there's also just concern about, you know, living in a world with fewer people would mean less innovation, fewer medical discoveries. Like, there are people who just don't think that's a good direction for humanity, to not encourage life and human life. So there's sort of that, not exactly economic reason, but just some people, that's a religious reason, but there is a secular lens to that as well.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways immigration has been the band-aid to declining birth rates, right? And like you said, then that has the potential to fuel um, certain uh, ethno-nationalism or other types of sentiments because the makeup of the population is changing.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely had a number of people say, well, we could just solve this with immigration. And I think that could solve for certain countries in the near term, but you're still left with the problems in those countries that the immigrants have come from, and it's not, necessarily a long-term solution. So while I am very pro-immigrant and think we should let many more people into this country, I do think that it's a little bit not getting at the problem to say, well, we can just open borders and that will solve it, because it's a global issue.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's interesting because we know that as women gain higher education and build their careers, they naturally, put off childbirth. But there's also all kinds of other considerations that people, no matter what your gender, have around having children. So I'm interested from your research, how are things like childcare costs or a poor public education system or student loans or housing costs or the fact that we don't live next to our extended families in the same neighborhoods anymore, how are all of these things contributing to this?
We know childcare is more expensive than many people's mortgages. I report on childcare at Vox, and I've talked with many families who say like, I have one kid, I can't afford to have another, but I wish I could, that kind of thing. So we know that there are people out there who say they would be interested in having more children or any children if it seemed more financially viable. And so a more um, a more progressive or secular version of pronatalism are the people who say, look, we're not talking about trying to force anyone to have children. We just want to make it easier for people to have the children that they otherwise want to have. We just want to make it more family friendly and build a society that encourages people to act on those desires. And I have no problem with that. That is, I think, similar to reproductive justice, which is, where I probably align more closely. But um, just to your original question, yes, we know that right now, especially in countries like the U.S., raising a child is extremely expensive, and most of those costs are borne on the individual parent household and not socialized by the government and society. Even though the children grow up and bring many benefits to society, as of course.
Yeah, I once read that, like, if you factored in a modest uh, college education, that the cost of a child would basically be $1 million by the time they were 20 years old. Like, that's what it would cost you. And I was like, that's crazy.
Those statistics float around the media and the ether, and it's hard not to hear those and just get personally like very overwhelmed. Most, that does shape people's feelings about opportunity and possibility.
And also, we're in a time period where it's there's less of a social stigma around having children. So maybe past generations, like socially, like that's just what you did. You got married, you had a family, and those were, that was what was expected of you, and you did that. And I feel like over the past couple of decades, we are moving to a place where that social stigma isn't as present, or people are feeling more um, more confident to not go down that path automatically. They might still go down that path later in life, but it's more intentional. They're doing it from more of a responsible place versus something that's more automatic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, obviously there's still pressure on people to have kids, but I think there is less stigma for people who choose not to. And I think the recent attacks on abortion rights has also helped sort of bring people more on the same page. Like, yes, you can't judge this person and also defend reproductive freedom, which people are doing. And so I think there's more recognition. And also, to your point, I think we do send a message now that, well, you should be in a financially secure place before you make that choice so that you can raise your children well and be comfortable. I do think that we have a problem in societies where people's career timelines and their reproductive windows are not really aligned very well. And it does seem sad. And I think pronatalists are right when they make this point that, like, right now we have a society that financially incentivizes people to wait to have kids until they're older, even though that's when it is harder to have kids. So, is there a world where we could make it easier for the people who want to have kids younger? I think that is possible. I think right now we don't really have that kind of economic system, and yeah, that maybe we could rethink some of that potentially.
And I think some countries are rethinking that. I have a friend of mine who lives in Finland, and she is at the top of her career working within NGOs alongside the government. And she's got 4 kids. And I watched her entire career over the past 20 years that we've been friends. I don't I mean, her career never skipped a beat, but that's because there are really great policies in place for her, socially and from the government to support her continuing her career, even though she was having kids.
That's really interesting. I get so jealous sometimes when I am studying, uh, especially Nordic policies. Interestingly, I'm actually have been researching Germany's childcare system recently for a different article, and something that's fascinating in Germany is that 2/3 of mothers work part time in Germany. It's very uncommon to go back full time after you have kids, and a lot of mothers want to do this, but it also then has pretty significant consequences on women's retirement. There's a huge gap in pensions between men and women because they are working less. But it's like subsidized childcare when you're younger, and they make it and they give you child benefits. So it's like easier to raise kids, but it does end up screwing over women, most women in their old age. So just something else I've been thinking about.
That's really interesting. What else have you discovered about other countries, that where they have attempted to address their declining population either successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah, so this is a big sort of debate in the pronatalism conversation of, can we use sort of financial incentives to voluntarily boost birth rates? Is that possible? And right now, we don't have an example of a country that has done that and then they've gone from below replacement rate to at replacement rate or above. So there's not been any country that we've that has sort of tried to use financial incentives and it has really reversed the decline. But most of the countries that have used incentives, they've been relatively small thus far. Like, you might have a couple countries like Italy and Singapore would give $4,000 a year effectively to families, which, if you think about the whole cost of raising a kid, that's not actually that much money. The child tax credit in the US, it's not specifically to induce child fertility, but like, it's not that much money when we think about how much it actually costs to raise a kid. So you have pronatalists who say, look, we've just never really tried this. We've never really designed policies that like actually could really move the needle. And there is some evidence, especially in European countries, but also some in Australia and elsewhere, of that generous paid leave policies have been shown to boost fertility. So there is some evidence that pro family policies can boost birth rates, but thus far we haven't seen any that sort of boost it a lot to the point where we're no longer having declining population. But then the point is like, well, what if we tried to make those much more generous, and what if we brought down other costs of living? So not just social policies, but like, if housing was more affordable, if people didn't have as much student loan debt, all of these things that compound that make the costs feel really daunting. Like, what if we addressed that and then saw? And I think there is a very fair case that like that hasn't been really tested. We still People are still very much dealing with all of their economic obligations right now.
And I also feel like we've got this society, I'm going to say, from a US centric place, but I can assume that it is in other places as well, maybe more global north countries, where you're sort of not seen as quote unquote successful unless you've got your own place and you're living by yourself, right? We have lost that extended family or village aspect of society where your aunts and uncles, your parents, grandma, the neighbors, like everybody kind of chipped in to watch the kids. And I see this with some of the women that I know through Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Like, the kids in school, okay, great, but at any time the kid could be sick, and now I've got to leave my job and go pick up the kid because now they're not allowed to be at school. Um, and so that disrupts the woman's career, and generally, still, it's the woman is the primary caregiver to go do those things, right? I don't. I feel like there's all these different layers.
Yeah, I also, and this is also maybe a US centric view, but I don't even know if it is. I think I had done some research for a different project last year where I was reading a lot of sort of some more of the cultural debates from the 2000s, where I there were a lot more of the so-called mommy war debates about if you're bad mom if you send your kid to daycare, or like, debates around working parents versus not. It's not that everyone, I think sometimes women in my generation get sort of mocked by culture writers as like, oh, we just want a girl boss and just want to like be workaholics. But it's really not that. I think it's more like we were taught that if you want to have security, if you want to not be, you know, absolutely devastated financially, then you need to like have a job, because you can't trust on a lot of other things in this country that doesn't have a very good safety net. And I feel like sometimes what's people cast women as like selfish when it's like, you told us to do this. This is exactly what we said we needed to do, you know?
Well, and just in broadly speaking, like women have, it's perfectly legitimate that a woman would want to pursue the same life goals as a man. And what society is grappling with is this motherhood penalty, right? And that penalty will follow you throughout your career if you are not intentional about making sure that it doesn't. And like you said, there's all this research and we hear all this stuff. And so so this is the big question for the future of like, how do we overcome, because I kind of feel like society's just been running on autopilot. Women are always going to want to have children, and we're always going to meet our replacement rate. Well, it's actually not the case, and it hasn't been the case for a long time. And like you said, it's the U.S. maybe thought that it was immune to this, but now that it's seen that it's not, it's becoming, more of a conversation globally is really starting to increase. And it also seems like um, people just want to throw money at the problem rather than addressing structural social um, aspects that are all contributing to these decisions in their own way. Because it's not like one thing is contributing to this decision, it is a layering of all of these different aspects of society.
There's kind of these two conversations happening parallel, and to me they feel very related, but they're not really engaging with one another. On the one hand, you have this declining birth rate conversation where people are really worried about how many workers we're going to have in the future to support the elderly and to support society and all these essential jobs. But on the other hand, we have the growth of AI, and we're hearing from all these people that this is going to displace millions of jobs. We're not going to need millions of the jobs we have, that we're going to be like, either it's going to be automated or just not necessary. And I think when I hear these, I'm like, so we don't really know how many workers we'll need in a generation, like, or even in 15 years at the rate of, I mean, I'm not saying I like want that world where AI just takes away everyone's jobs, but it does feel like we are developing technology that is allegedly supposed to be able to do a lot of what people do right now. And so what that at least says to me is that we should at least be a little humble by our confidence of our calamitous predictions, because I don't think we have a very good sense of what we'll need and who will do what. And like, there's just so much changing right now, and it's a good conversation to have, but I do feel like some people are a little too um confident that they know what will happen.
Yeah, and I get from the governmental policy point of view, you need people because you need to be able to collect taxes on people. So you need people working and earning, and like the whole structure is set up that way. It's the same challenge that housing has with, R1 single family home is zoned for this place. No, you can't put three tiny homes on it, right? Like, it's the same challenge. And and you're right, automation, AI, robotics, all of these things are coming. And also we have climate change as well. And there's a lot of legitimacy to the idea that the very best thing you can do to to mitigate the worst effects of climate change is to have one less child than you planned. But most people don't want to hear that, or they don't want to promote that, right? Because from a social standpoint, we need more people so that we can have tax revenue to fund all these things.
Yeah. I was I admit I was surprised. I got a lot of reader emails frustrated with me for not talking about that in my piece. I sort of I guess I think about the past population panics we've had where we thought we had too many people or we thought countries were reproducing too fast. I tend to I don't have a strong position on that. I tend to think that the general antinatalism culture is does make all of society less family friendly, or it has had that effect, and that does worry me. um but I mean, there's like, you're right that there's a lot of, I mean, some people may decide not to do it, but there is this weird um dynamic now where certainly some people like judge people if they have 3 kids because they say you're being bad for the climate. I think some of that conversation gets a little dicey, but um it would be easier to have, I think, if we also lived in a culture that was making it easier for people to have kids who wanted. Whereas right now we sort of have like this: don't have children because you're going to hurt the planet, and if you have children, it's going to be terrible and bankrupt you. And it's like just not the best combination of factors.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I should be upfront. I don't have kids. And I chose to focus on my career.
Yeah.
And that's, and I think I had a moment where I was like, well, if I believe in multiple lifetimes, then I've had children in the past. So why do I feel like I need to do it now? I'm a great aunt
Yeah.
and I love
Yeah.
all my friends' kids. And I think as we continue, like you said, as we continue through this, um, helping people to make this choice from a place of confidence rather than
Yeah.
uh, something else, I think is really what society is grappling with.
I would just add, I think something that's worth talking about in the pronatalism conversation, I do think there is an element to which people feel on all ends of the spectrum feel more comfortable talking about babies than they do talking about seniors. And so I think if a real problem and a real anxiety that is at the heart of this conversation is how are we going to take care of our seniors, like, let's talk about that. And the idea that we're going to focus on birth rates as the solution or the prompt, it feels to me like sometimes connected to the fact that people are just bad at about talking about getting older and aging in the society, and it's almost easier just like, let's go back to even like pre-born because that's we're more comfortable there, and youth forever. um and like we're just the society is bad at talking about getting older, and I think confronting that is maybe a more direct way to get at some of the problems that some of our pronatalism conversation
That's
dances
interesting. So
around.
you're saying because like so much of our social structures and social safety nets are dependent on younger people paying for the seniors and maybe our if we maybe there's a way to restructure those safety nets so that they're not dependent on the decisions of people in the future
Well,
to have children.
I think we should definitely be like, yeah, I think that we should definitely be talking about it. I guess there's just sort of this way I think I observed as I was reporting this that, like, we're not we don't do an awesome job now of taking care of seniors. Like, there's so many aspects where elder care is just rife with horrible dynamics, and there's sort of this way in which people are like, well, if we don't have more babies in a generation, it's going to be a lot worse. And it's like, what if we talked about how to improve elder care today, and that probably would help in a generation too, but it's sort of always easier to be looking a generation down the line than to look around us and talk about like the really gaping glaring problems that we have with seniors today.
We talked a lot about some of the challenges related to all these different factors that are might be influencing people to have fewer children, and that some of these policies that have been put in place really haven't gone to the been as effective because maybe they just didn't really commit to providing the support that was really necessary. So if you had a magic wand to change these support systems or the way society is set up that you think would help encourage people to have more children, what would you do based on all the research that you've done?
I think I definitely would focus on housing. I think that's a huge deterrent for people. I think a lot of young people, including me right now, like move to cities. That's where all the jobs are. Cities and housing are really not built for families. There's even cities that are building new housing, developers right now are almost completely incentivized to just build 1 and 2 bedroom apartments because they're trying to maximize the number of units in a building. And so 3 bedroom or let alone 4 bedroom apartments, you can't really find them anywhere. And so if you're someone who likes their career, likes their lifestyle in the city, and you're getting to an age where you sort of would maybe want to have a fit kid or have kids, but that would require moving to the suburbs, getting a car, like just adopting a completely different kind of lifestyle and being further away, um I think definitely childcare. I know it weighs on the minds of so many people kind of considering it because as we were talking about earlier, like most women work. We were encouraged to work, we found careers, we don't want to just give that up. And so looking for policies that help make balancing those two things easier, I think, is really important. I think there has been a trend towards men doing more childcare. I think that needs to continue, and domestic work. I think those things really need to continue. I think there was a study I read in Sweden, I believe, that showed how much men did in terms of taking parental leave and domestic care with the first kid played a really big role in Sweden on women if they wanted to have a second kid. So there's like a lot of sort of cultural dynamics that we can imagine about like this is not just on a woman. Like men would need to sort of demonstrate and prove that they could help women live those sorts of lives, which I would love to see as kind of a I think we've had a really important, and I definitely don't want to overstate it because we're still in a very intense fight for reproductive rights right now in the United States. But I think there's been a lot of education that people have had, including men, particularly men, maybe, about how important these things are. And I do feel like while we've been really on the reproductive rights piece, I like would love to see us move a little more to reproductive justice and sort of also think about what do we need to do to make not just protect people who don't want to have kids or have kids right now, but like make it more possible for people to have the kids they want. And I think that does involve more men education, culture change. Um, yeah, I'm very pro like socializing as much cost as we can of parenthood, making those shared costs, not putting it on individual families. And I think maybe we'll learn then that people still don't want to, and then we'll have to like think about like if people don't want to, they don't want to, and we need to then think of something else. But I think we didn't even really talk on this episode about the scary pronatalists because there are like J.D. Vance and some of the more authoritarian ideas floating around. But I think there are some ideas in the pronatalism space that I think are not, scary or far right and should be thought about more. And a lot of those have to do with like what could we do at least to make it more possible for the people who would want to have kids to feel empowered to do that.
It's you mentioned childcare. I think childcare, like if you want to fix, for me personally, just from what I've seen, running women's groups and have watching my friends build their careers,
Hmm.
that childcare piece is so critical. And some women I've watched just drop out of the workforce because basically their entire salary was going to childcare. And they felt like, well,
Hmm.
that isn't an exchange that I'm interested in. I might as well just stay home and raise my kids myself and have that experience. Um, and then we hear a lot from corporations saying we need more women in leadership roles, and where are all the women? I'm like, all the women, they look what happened when they had kids. Like, that's your problem. Like, either they're
Right.
dropping out or their careers slow down significantly, or like you said, they take part-time work, they need flexible hours, all of these things, which doesn't always align with a
Yeah.
career path that gets you to the C-suite.
I think there should be more pressure on companies, like more calling out. Like we rate companies on a lot of measures publicly, and I think there should be more kind of public naming and shaming sort of things for companies that are not making it possible to raise like raising families should be seen as something that recognized as if that's what you want to do, you are doing a service to not just you but to like society. And if your company is not supporting that sort of work, I think that we should be like calling that out more than we currently do.
And I think there's some equity and fairness there as well, because if you choose, like, if you're somebody who chooses not to have kids, but everybody who are parents at your job, they all get to have these flexible schedules and
Oh
leave,
yeah,
or like
right, right,
randomly
right.
like take the kid to the doctor or whatever. Like, those are duties that they need to do, but there is,
Yeah.
some fairness there. I know one company where the people that don't have kids, they're allowed to pick their thing that is their parenting duty. So, like,
Oh,
one person
cool.
has like gardening, or like they're helping somebody build a garage or whatever. And so they'll have to say, okay, I've got garage parenting duties today. I got to
Oh,
go
that's
do this
funny.
thing that was unexpected.
Yeah,
And I thought that was pretty
that's
cool,
smart.
because
Yeah.
then it's more equitable, I think.
Do you know who has one of the most highly regarded childcare systems in the world? The Department of Defense. It's like high quality. It's all over the world. Like it's sort of very well regarded. So we know how to build these. We know how to do employer childcare. Like we actually have very good models. The DoD is a great model. Um, I think, yeah, I'm pretty excited to keep following. I think there's been a encouraging shift in political conversation around childcare. It's not just Democrats. It was like the second question in the Republican presidential primary debate last fall that they asked about because COVID childcare subsidies were expiring, and then they also asked it in the Biden Trump debate in June. Neither presidential candidate answered the question, but the fact that it was asked, I felt like, wow, okay, this is something that is being recognized as a issue that is important to people all over the spectrum, which of course it
Yeah,
is, but
and what a great way to get people to come into the office is if their
yeah.
child services are there, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But I think this is okay, so this is a fascinating conversation. My last question for you is, because we're a futurology podcast, I always am looking to the future, and I know asking reporters to make futuristic predictions can be a little bit of a risk, but I'm going to go for it anyway. Um, when you look at the the future, so let's look at, like, you know, 20, 30 years out. What do you predict is going to happen related to our population rates, and how reproductive justice and how all of these things are going to play out in the next couple of decades?
Oh man. I mean, I I think the answer to that is going to depend on what we see in the next decade, like with these far right parties getting elected, the directions of those. I think the next 10 years are going to be so pivotal for reproductive rights in the US. Like we're either going to continue to see it, or there's going to be, as we've seen the last year and a half, kind of a pushback. And I think if we I just read an article about in Russia, Putin is pushing sort of as this national policy is trying to get women to have 8 kids again. It's
I read
very,
that
very,
too.
very scary stuff. And I feel like we're really at this juncture between just like feminine, like there are powerful people right now trying to blame feminists for so many things, and it's absurd, but I feel like we're really at this moment where we need to like defend it and kind of um you know persuade people that this is not the solutions being proposed over there. Those are bad, and that's one thing that did worry me a little bit researching pronatalism. Is I do worry that if people become, and I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, but I worry that if people become really alarmed by birth rates per se, they might warm to more reactionary ideas that we don't want to be,
Yeah.
on the table again or at all. Um, so I guess just to bring it back to your question, I want to believe that in a couple of decades we are going to have a great system, much more family friendly, that respects everyone's rights and opportunities and is not blaming women for whatever economic problem du jour is on the table. Because of course there will be different economic problems in 20 to 30 years, and I'm sure there will be some people who want to blame women because that's how it goes. I can't say with strong confidence that's what we're going to happen, but like I certainly hope that we're going to work and that people listen to this podcast and talk with their friends and kind of get wise to what is at stake. And yeah, so I'm still optimistic. I'm just a little nervous.
I hear you. I feel the same way. I feel like if things are trending towards people having fewer kids, then that's then society gets a way to figure out how to support that versus
Mhm.
trying to force people to have more kids than they actually want.
Totally.
Um, and and like you said, AI, robotics, automation, all of these things are going to come about to expand the opportunities for folks to make those choices and not feel they're um, like they're doing their country a disservice by not having more children. And
Totally.
then, of course, you've got
Totally.
the entire commercialization of space. So people are going to go to space, and then they're probably going to want to have kids so that they can continue the colony on Mars or something like that.
It's funny you say that because I did listen to a lot of the speeches that they gave at the the natal conference last year, which had a lot of extreme voices as well, a lot of anti-feminist speakers at that. But they did have someone who said, well, part of the answer to our fertility problem is we just need, more pioneers. When you pioneer a place, then so we need to explore the sea, we need to explore space. That will help boost birth rates, which I found, I was like, huh, I kind of get it.
Because you need that built-in workforce, for your
Like people have a lot, don't have that much to do.
yeah, for your space farm. You need people
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
help you grow the food, right?
I spoke with one demographer who was more critical of some of the she was a little more critical of the pronatalist movement, and she was just like, I feel like there's a lot of lack of imagination. Like nobody, who are we to say what the world is gonna look like in 100 years? Like so much could change, and I think that goes with our AI conversation, but it's even broader. Like we could just part of the reason that we needed more bigger families was when we had a different economic system too. So um, and lots of kids you couldn't assume they would survive childhood because we didn't have all these vaccines that we have today. There's so many things that sort of helped encourage that kind of thing, and lots of glorification of women with 12 children.
Earthlings, it is clear that the solution to declining birth rates isn't going to come from one place. Rachel and I talked about a myriad of solutions, and that's really the challenge, right? It's many layers that have led to this so called problem. And, maybe it isn't actually a problem in the future because of AI and automation and robotics that'll come online. So who knows, right? Um, but I think it's important for us to have these conversations because clearly, at the end of the day, there is still a motherhood penalty, and there can be a challenge balancing career and and parenting for both genders, not just women. So this is there's going to be a lot of opportunities for us to pursue the here, And I think Rachel's point about how housing could be better designed to encourage people to continue living in cities and grow their families is a really interesting observation, because obviously the last thing we want is people to feel pressured into having children who really don't want them, or we don't want them feeling resentful that they could have had a different type of life if they hadn't had children. So we want to create these incentives that are a an encouraging nudge, without people feeling like something's being forced upon them, because as we all know, force only lasts for so long, and people don't like it. So Earthlings like to be in charge of their own destiny and make their own decisions, right? So how can we encourage that while also trying to create outcomes that we might want? Obviously, there's no easy answer, but Rachel's extensive research on this topic and others related to it is really important, and we commend her and thank her for being on the show. And I encourage you to become a fan because she's got some good stuff that she's talking about. We're going to go from birth to death this week as our faith in humanity is restored by Alejandro Ramon. He is a former Valencia city climate counselor who took the problem of low availability of land in his city in Spain to find a solution from an unlikely place: cemeteries. His project is aptly named Requiem in Power, RIP, and it aims to transform 3 cemeteries in Valencia into the largest urban solar farm in Spain. The initiative is going to install 7,000 solar panels across 3 cemeteries and generate over 440,000 kilowatts of power a year. This is going to remove 140 tons of carbon a year. Alejandro highlighted that the practicality of this approach is eminent in the fact that there's a lot of cemetery land that can be made available, and the mausoleum roofs are actually pretty suitable for solar panels, which I thought was pretty interesting. And this concept isn't unique to Valencia. There's also a town in France that has done this as well. And the whole idea, I think, is transforming this land that, while important, doesn't get a lot of foot traffic usually. Sometimes these sections of our city are forgotten about, and being able to use them in a dual purpose way, I find very interesting, especially when you think about how these cemeteries typically are in urban centers, and so there's less of a need for long distance transmission lines. So I think it's pretty neat. And cities around the world are going to keep looking for innovative ways to combat climate change, and Valencia's cemetery solar farms offers a really compelling model. So we commend Alejandro and his entire team in Valencia for their creative approach to renewable energy on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.